Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of Concerned Lay Catholics, I would like to welcome you to this very timely webinar presentation. My name is Gary Warner, and on behalf of the CLC Planning Group, I thank you for your attendance today. Concerned Lay Catholics, CLC, is an independent group which came together informally at first in 2018 in response to the scandal of clergy sexual abuse in our church. Since that time, we have come to understand more deeply the critical role that the laity can and must play in promoting healing and reconciliation for all individuals and groups who have been wounded by our church. We endeavor through our various programs and activities to help lay Catholics find their own voice and bring it forth in order to live out the laity's role of co-responsibility in our church. Today's topic, the Church's guiding star, Vatican II and Synodality, presented by Dr. Massimo Faggioli, is indeed timely as we seek to understand more fully how this seemingly new concept, synodality, is in fact deeply embedded in our tradition. We seek to understand also how we must use Vatican II as the reference point for future discernment. CLC is committed to bringing the best in Catholic thought to our diverse community so that our actions may be inspired by thoughtful reflection on scripture, church teaching, and the sensus fidei. Please explore our website, concernedlaycatholics.ca, and sign up on our contact page if you would like to receive our monthly newsletter, which highlights news, events, and upcoming presentations. I will now offer as our opening prayer the prayer for the Synod on Synodality. In the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. We stand before you, Holy Spirit, as we gather together in your name, with you alone to guide us. Make yourself at home in our hearts. Teach us the way we must go and how we are to pursue it. We are weak and sinful. Do not let us promote disorder. Do not let ignorance lead us down the wrong path, nor partiality influence our actions. Let us find in you our unity so that we may journey together to eternal life and not stray from the way of truth and what is right. All this we ask of you who are at work in every place and time in the communion of the Father and the Son, forever and ever. Amen. So I now ask my colleague, Beverly Bronte-Tinkyu, to offer CLC's land acknowledgement and our statement of solidarity with victims of sexual abuse. Bev?
Thank you, Gary, and hello and welcome to everyone wherever you are on the planet today. We acknowledge that many of the lands we live, work, and meet on are the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples across this country. As settlers, it is our responsibility to learn about and acknowledge our colonial history and the ways in which we may continue to perpetuate it. As people of faith working for justice, we are called to discern how we are to respond to the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and how we can support Indigenous peoples across this land we know as Canada. Our CLC statement of solidarity is as follows. We stand in solidarity with all victims of clergy sexual abuse. We are moved by compassion to reflect deeply on the suffering of our wounded brothers and sisters and to pray for them always. We make a commitment to educate ourselves and others about the devastating impact of the scandal in our church. We promise to promote justice and healing for victims and their families, and all those injured by this betrayal of our deepest values. We commit ourselves to the transformation of church structures and clerical structure that put protecting the institution above justice for victims and accountability for offenders. We rely on God in all of this, asking that we may be sustained in this commitment we have made. I now invite Mark Guevara to introduce our special guest today.
Hello, everyone. It is an honor for me to introduce our speaker, Massimo Faggioli. Dr. Faggioli is professor of ecclesiology at Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland, where he joins us at 7 p.m. local time. He is a columnist for La Croix International and a contributing writer for Commonweal. Prior to his tenure at Trinity, Professor Faggioli was professor between 2016 and 2025 at Villanova University in Philadelphia, Pope Leo's alma mater. Professor Faggioli has published many books and articles exploring global and American Catholicism, Vatican II, ecclesiology, the papacy, the laity, and synodality. Among his recent publications are The Liminal Papacy of Pope Francis, Moving Toward Global Catholicity from 2020. From 2023, the Oxford Handbook of Vatican II, co-edited with Catherine Clifford, a friend of Concerned Lay Catholics, who's with us today. And from 2024, Global Catholicism Between Disruption and Encounter. Massimo has a unique gift for interpreting history as well as contemporary issues in the world and in the church, and therefore enabling listeners to more fully discern the signs of the times. In a time of great global instability, Massimo's keen insight offers clarity and challenge to us all. Professor Faggioli helps us to think historically without becoming nostalgic, critically without becoming cynical, and hopefully without becoming naive. I'm so blessed to have him on my doctoral committee, and we are so privileged to hear his insights today. Dear friends, I present to you Massimo Faggioli.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this very kind introduction. Thank you to Concerned Lay Catholics for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to stay connected with friends whom I met many years ago and in North America, which has given me so much in terms of my understanding of the church, of history, and of synodality. Because I came to America in 2008 without very little insight on the global dimension of the church. And when Pope Francis was elected and the synodal process started, I really was blessed by my American experience because that gave me an idea of how global the church is, and this is really key to understanding how we should connect Vatican II and synodality and try to understand what's happening with Pope Leo today. So here, the first step that I would say it's necessary to take is to understand what's the role of the Second Vatican Council for synodality. And it's a double role in the sense that is both a pool of resources, both as texts, as documents, but also as the event of the Second Vatican Council. But also, Vatican II represents a limit, kind of a boundary that sets a little bit what we can draw from Vatican II to build synodality. So what is the positive part that we can draw from Vatican II to understand synodality? Because in the language, in the glossary of the Second Vatican Council, the word synodality doesn't exist. It's never mentioned in the final documents as a noun, and when it is used as an adjective, synodal, or as the noun of the institution from which the word synodality comes from, synod, it means different things. So here in the language of the Second Vatican Council, which draws from the traditional Latin language, synod is a synonym for council, and specifically Vatican II. So here, synod at Vatican II means something that concerns the bishops only as participants, as those who have a right to speak, have a right to vote, right? And so this is one of the things that we have to keep in mind. Vatican II, when they talk about synods, it's about either Vatican II or previous councils or synods of a different kind that are planned and legislated by Vatican II that will become, in canon law, a few years after Vatican II, the diocesan synods or other synodal bodies for the governance of the church at the local level, which are a mix of the old Council of Trent 16th, 17th century idea of how to get the church out of the mess of the Reformation, and something new, meaning the acknowledgement that at Vatican II they had that we need to involve more the lay people. But in the language of the Second Vatican Council, synod and synodal assumes still very much a predominance of the bishops' voices in those bodies or of the clergy in those bodies, and an auxiliary presence of the lay people. So this is it's a mix of old and new, and so there's a new part saying this is a church that exists for the lay people, not for the hierarchy, not for the clergy. Okay. But there's a lot that comes from a previous tradition that simply didn't have to deal with the 20th century, with democracy, with the social movements, and so on. And so there's a mix of old and new, and of something that we can draw actively from Vatican II to build synodality today, and something that is very limited. Why these limits? Because for Vatican II, the big frontier was how to reestablish a certain balance in the governance of the church between a healthy idea of the church as a communion, as a people of God, and what had happened, especially in the 19th century, with the explosion of clericalism, and in a very particular form that took in the 19th century the name of ultramontanism, right? So the idea that the papacy is the only absolute source of power and of law in the church. And so that was the challenge in terms of ecclesiology, of how to develop a healthier idea of governing the church at the Second Vatican Council. So how to restore some balance between an all-powerful papacy, the First Vatican Council, papal infallibility, and so on, with the idea that this is a church that is made by 99.5 or 6% of lay people. And the solution to do that at Vatican II is collegiality. So it's the idea that is very old, but got lost in the centuries, that the Pope in Rome, the Pope as the Bishop of Rome, and all bishops around the world in the Catholic Church, they are member of one same collegium in Latin, college, meaning a a group, and they share one same episcopal ordination. The episcopal ordination of the Bishop of Rome is not different from the episcopal ordination of the Bishop of Dublin or of Montreal. And so it is collegiality, right? So it's the idea that there is a group of peers who, in some moments, they govern together the church. And so that was a big breakthrough in the history of ecclesiology, because Vatican II finally declares formally for the first time that all bishops, with the Bishop of Rome in a particular role, they are peers in one same group where one bishop is one vote. One bishop is one diocese, right? And so there's a fundamental democratic equality in that bishop, in that college, right? So what's the limit for us today after 60 years? Well, because that college is only for bishops. So to be an active member of something that goes beyond that old monarchical ultra-papalist idea of the church, you have to be a bishop. Otherwise, you are a lay member of the church and you are just on the receiving end of what the episcopacy, either your individual bishop or the whole college of the bishops together with the Pope decides, right? And so that for us sounds limited, right? But at Vatican II, that was a great advancement. And it caused a huge crisis and a lot of conversations, especially around 1963, which is the year when they drafted the key version of what would become the constitution on the church, Lumen Gentium, right? So this is important because Vatican II, and so the ecclesiology of the Second Vatican Council, is not about synodality yet. It is about collegiality, which sounds too little for us. The real important thing to understand is that there cannot be synodality without collegiality, right? And so this is a passage that needed to happen and needs to happen still today, right? And so this is one thing that we need to understand when we say synodality is about reviving Vatican II. Well, yes, but it's more than Vatican II. It goes beyond Vatican II in some sense. And so that's the first thing that we should keep in mind, right? Second problem or asset is that in the conversation on synodality in these last 10 years, or since Pope Francis, right, the conversation on synodality has been developed and initiated by Pope Francis in the context of a particular institution that is the Synod of Bishops, or Synod simply. So it's not clear what's going to be the name from now on, but I think it's going to be back to Synod of Bishops, right? And that made perfect sense, right? Because Pope Francis knew that he had to convince the bishops first about synodality. And the Synod of Bishops, which is what we saw very prominently in the media in these last few years, is the place where, especially under Pope Francis, we saw conversations of a synodal nature much more than before. Even before Pope Francis said the Synod of 2023-24 will be on synodality, right? Because if you remember, for example, the Synod of 2014-2015 on the marriage and family was very much synodal because Pope Francis opened that conversation to different voices and contributions without making that too public, right? But it was very different from the synod celebrated under Pope Benedict or under John Paul II, right? So here, synodality for us in these last 10 to 13 years is something that the church has discussed in the Synod of Bishops, which under Pope Francis became something different. But the Synod of Bishops of Bishops as an institution was created during Vatican II and created by Paul VI in September 1965 as an instrument not of synodality as we expect it to be now, but in 65 was created as an instrument of collegiality. So here, when we apply synodality to something that comes out of the synod today, it is correct historically because of what happened in this last decade, right? But if we look at the history of the institution synod, it's something that was supposed to be for bishops only. And this is where we are now with Pope Leo. We don't know yet what's going to be the role of the synod of bishops in synodality. It's one of the open questions, right? And so this is something that we need to keep in mind because it comes naturally from many of us that, of course, we have to be synodal, we have to develop synodality because we have such an important institution called the Synod of Bishops. But actually, that is a projection of what we have expected, desired in these last 12 years, and not the original institution of the Synod in 1965, which was until the end of the pontificate of Pope Benedict entirely a body made of bishops only. So it's one of those things that happened under Pope Francis, a big revolution that he said we should open this synod to other components. And so under Pope Francis became a synod with bishops, not of bishops anymore, right? So that's something that helps us understand how much of a jump we have done or we're trying to do since Pope Francis, and thanks to Pope Francis' pontificate. So a third thing that we should keep in mind is that, and again, it's part of the pluses and minuses of Vatican II when we look at synodality, is that Vatican II is very clear that we have to move beyond a clerical idea of the church, the theology of the lay people, and so on. But at the same time, what Vatican II says of the theology of the lay people, he owes more to the theology of the 1940s, 50s, than to the theology of the church and of everything that is developed at Vatican II. So here there is a certain disconnect between what we know Vatican II was and became, Gaudium et Spes, the freedom of religion, ecumenism, non aetate, all of that on the one side. And on the other side, we have a theology of the lay people that is pretty much a development and improvement of the best theology on the lay people that was developed before Vatican II. So this happens also for other issues, for example, the document of the Council on the Religious Orders, Perfecte Caritatis. It's a 1950 theology that is updated in the context of the Second Vatican, but it's not a rethinking, right? How do we see that? Well, from many things, but especially from one. So when we talk about synodality today, we start from the assumption that every Catholic, every member of the church has or can do something for the church, for the ministry of the church, in terms of catechesis, in terms of accompaniment, all of that. The theology of the lay people at Vatican II, both in Lumen Gentium, but also in Ad Gentes and in Apostolica Actuositatem, they have an idea of the role of the lay people that is a little different. How it is different in this? They say the lay people are essential collaborators to the mission of the church for what the church has to do outside in the world, right? So in politics, in the media, in culture, in education, social services, peacemaking, all of that. But what needs to happen in the church for the governance of the church and so on, this will continue to be part of the ministry of the ordained and, and of the religious. And so here there's an idea at Vatican II in the documents, especially that lay people are supposed to work outside of the church, not as ministers of something that usually was done by members of the clergy. So this is something that has changed for us, right? And so we take for granted that there are some ecclesial ministries that lay people do within the, the, the church. And so we have accepted now that the only things that only clergy can do in the church of today are consecrating the Eucharist and hearing confessions. Okay, but all the rest can be done by lay ministries, lay people, right? That's not how Vatican II thinks about that, right? And so in just 60 years, we have seen how much this has changed in our common understanding of what is the role of the lay people in the church. This is really part not just of a obvious institutional resistance to open new spaces for lay people, but also because at the time of the Second Vatican Council, you did not need lay people to do things for which you had an abundance of clergy and of religious, but also there was a very deep-seated theology of the relations between the church and the world, where there is a clear distinction between church and world, and lay people are supposed to be outside in the world. And so right now, in these last few decades, we have understood that this idea that there is a church ad intra, so what we do inside and what we do outside, is largely fictional. It's a projection of how we would like things to be, but they are not like that. But the Vatican II, there was still this very, again, deep-seated idea that church and world, they are different things. And the business of the church in the church and outside, they are different things. And lay people are supposed to do that work that is outside. That's no longer how we look at that, or at least most of us, right? So here, why do we need, or we needed to come up with synodality? Well, because so many things happened since Vatican II that the theological limits of Vatican II became evident, and that some realities that were happening, in many cases, upon invitation of the church itself, did not correspond anymore to those documents, to those texts of the Second Vatican Council. This is, by the way, very normal, right? Because if you look at the church at the beginning of the 17th century, right, early 1600s, it's already a situation that has gone beyond what the Council of Trent had imagined just 40, 50 years before, right? And so this gap is totally normal, right? What's happening right now, thanks to Pope Francis mostly, is that with synodality, we have realized we have an opportunity to bridge that gap between the intuitions of the Second Vatican Council that are still valid and some of those expressions in those texts, in those codes that no longer work. And so what happened since Vatican II that has made synodality really not an option, but an urgency, something that is very hard to deny that it is necessary. Well, as we have heard in the beginning of tonight, of today's event, the biggest shock was the abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, which now we know it's far bigger than just a clerical abuse crisis. It started becoming shocking when we knew about those abuses committed by clergy, but we know it's something that covers a wider spectrum of actions, of victims, of perpetrators, of those who knew, who said nothing, and so on. And so that has been one of the engines for synodality to, prompt a reflection on what is the church in need of today. And even before that started in the Vatican, the popes, it starts even before. And so they start thinking about something like a synodal national event in Australia, for example, in 2011, even during Pope Benedict. So they say we need to do something like this, an event that is involving of different kinds of people. So here there is the abuse crisis, which is really a global event, transnational, global, multi-level, and so on, which tells us that there are some things that Vatican II did not see, or actually some saw, because there is, for example, in 1960, there is a proposal coming from the Pontifical University of the Salesians in Rome. In 1960, they sent a proposal to the committee who was in charge of drafting the agenda of the Second Vatican Council, saying we need to have a discussion on the problem of abuse in the church. As you know, the Salesians are specialized in the pastoral ministry with the youth and so on. And so in 1960, they sent this proposal, and the higher ups in this committee, they say, well, this is not really a big urgency for us, right? That's so they had this chance, and it didn't happen for many reasons, right? And so here there is this crisis which tells us what? That we live in an age of a vertical collapse of the trust in institutions. And the church is a community, it's a communion, it's a people, it's also an institution. It needs to have institutional structure, institutional mechanisms for training priests, for evaluating them, a system of local churches, of religious orders. And the church has been deeply hit by the trust in institutions of all kinds, right? And so synodality as a communal aspect, okay, but also institutional, because if we didn't have a pope like Francis who brought up this issue, we would not be talking about synodality today, right? And so synodality is essential to make some things happen, right? So that's one thing that is very close to us in the English-speaking context, maybe more than in Italy, where this issue is perceived as someone else's problem, right? But this is very close to us. Second, we have in the Second Vatican Council, after the Second Vatican Council, we have a wave of new energies in the church, the new movements, the pacifist movements, the women movement in the Catholic Church that do not find an adequate response in the institutional structure, or a negative response often. And so they organize themselves in parallel movements universes. So they still are part of the church, but it has become hard to make their voices heard within the church. And for some, this is not a problem, right? So they are outside and they should stay outside, period. And for others, that is a problem, right? And so for Pope Francis, this was a problem. So we needed to find ways to incorporate these energies, these forces, in an ecclesial dynamic. And synodality is one of those ways to do that. It's a response to do that. And it's an acknowledgement also by Pope Francis when he started this, that the institutional church needs to operate within the framework given by canon law and by norms. But if we let the law run the church, this is a ruin. This is a disaster. And so we need the law in the same way we need medicine. We need drugs when we are sick. Okay? But our own life cannot be, sustained by medicines only. So we need real food that gives us real energies, and that cannot come only from institutional mechanisms. And so this is something that was much easier to realize after Vatican II, after the 70s, right now. And canon law has been incredibly important. We found out in these last few years when we had successful norms for the prevention, for example, of abuse. So canon law, it is important, but it cannot be the only item on your diet as a church, as a Catholic, as a believer, and so on. And so synodality has been a response to the slow reception by canon law of the Second Vatican Council and of what else happened that gave life to the church here. And so what we saw in these last 10 years has been a very diverse picture of different synodal experiences around the world. And so we had a universal level, as I said, the synods of 2014, 2015, and then 2018 on the youth, and 2019 on the Amazon region, and then 23, 24 on synodality, very lively synods. I'm old enough to remember that these the synods of bishops called by John Paul II and by Pope Benedict, they were not newsworthy. No one was paying attention to what, because they were scripted, by and large scripted. Maybe there was one or two interesting speeches sometimes, but there was nothing that was happening, right? And so that was the top level, right? And then we had continental, national, and local level of synodal experiences that have been very different, right? If you compare the German example, which is the most famous because of its radicalism and so on, if you compare that with the synod in the United States, right, you had two very different pictures. You had a very interesting example in Australia, because again, it was something that, so they started thinking even before Francis was elected. We had other experiences like Italy, started very slow, but it has shown really interesting signs of energy in these last couple of years, right? And so this is something that, so we're still collecting data, what has happened in the Catholic Church in the synodal experience under Pope Francis. And the fact that we all know is that Pope Francis died just a few months after the end of the first phase of the reception of the synod on synodality. And where we are now with Pope Leo, who's just 2 weeks from celebrating his first anniversary of the election, and Pope Leo received this task to implement something that he was part of, but that he did not initiate. Right? And so his synodality really played an important part in the transition from Pope Francis to the conclave and to Pope Leo, because I think we saw a few things that are important for us. First, I don't think it is an accident or a coincidence that we have the second pope in a row coming from Latin America as a bishop, two bishops coming from an experience of pastors in Latin America. Why is that? Because Latin America is the most important continent where we saw Vatican II at work, really changing uh, the posture of the church continentally, because you had a certain kind of Latin American Catholicism before 1965 and something else after 1965. So here I think so there's a lot to be said about how much global Catholicism and its effort towards synodality, how much we owe to the Latin American experience. That is, it is hard for me because I'm not an expert of Latin American Catholicism, but it's clear that there's something that can come from there that cannot come in the same way from a European bishop or a North American bishop. And so that's one thing that it is important. This is the first pope who was elected being part of a bishop synod where the bishops were not the only members of that synod. And so there were many members who were not bishops, not male, not ordained. And Kathy Clifford, whom you know very well, was one of them. So I think he is a pope who has gone through the experience of working together in a very intense month, twice in 12 months, of collaborating with non-bishops. It's something that was affecting very closely those who were bishops there and no longer enjoyed the privilege to be the only one who can speak and can vote. So I think this is different from the experience of the previous popes who were active at synods, like famously John Paul II, before being elected in 78, he had been very important at the synod of Paul VI in the 70s. But that was not a synodal experience as we know it in its full meaning of synodal. And so this is something that must be remembered. I think. I also think there are. So there's one thing that we should remember about the conclave of May 2025. It's a conclave where we know that some cardinals expressed the sense of a certain synodal fatigue, so that they were tired of the experience, not necessarily because they didn't like it. And so when we have a lot of diaries of the participants at Vatican II who talked about the conciliar fatigue. It is really stressful. It is really, and so you had this conclave of May 25, where you were after a pontificate who had invested so much, and after a few years since 2021, I mean 4 years basically, where the agenda of the individual bishops, but also of bishop conferences, had been changed, interjected, or hijacked by the synodal conversation. And so that was part of the conclave of 2025, and not always, again, not always against synodality, but also because expressing what meant for some of them in their task as pastors. So here, what can we say about Pope Leo and synodality after 1 year? So let's say from the start that Pope Leo has started slow. Also because he was elected in the middle of a jubilee. And if you are the Pope during a jubilee, you really have to obey the schedule that someone else has prepared for you. It's really hard, right? And so until the end of 25, it didn't have much freedom to decide how much energy, how much time to devote on certain things. He has said a few things and he has done a few things since the Jubilee ended. And he started right away because, as you know, on the 7th of January, he announced that all catechesis during the general audiences of Wednesday will be devoted to the Second Vatican Council. And so he started every week when he's not traveling, like in these last 2 weeks, a series of catechesis on Vatican II, which is, I think, it's a way to reconnect the synodal process and the Second Vatican Council. And how did he start? He started with Dei Verbum, with the document on Revelation and on Scripture. And then he moved on to Lumen Gentium, the Constitution on the Church. So he's reconnecting with Vatican II, with those texts, with catechesis that are really Vatican II 101, really the very basic but fundamental things that every Catholic should know about Vatican II, and without which you cannot make sense of synodality. And so here I think Pope Leo understood there was a need to make a step back and say, okay, what is this Vatican II that synodality so often talks about, right? And so that's been one thing that I think is suggestive of how Pope Leo is looking at synodality right now. I think that with Pope Leo we have more clarity as a church on what are the realistic possibilities of the Second Vatican Council and synodality today, meaning not a revolution, but a real reform, yes. Pope Leo is much more cautious, he's more pragmatic, but also more realistic, probably, right? And so his view of synodality is more down to earth. Also because, as you know, his doctoral formation was in canon law, and he studied the best lawyers and theologians at his time in the 80s, right? And so he has an approach that is more institutional, but also more realistic to the whole project, I think. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because Pope Leo, I think, I mean, I'm finishing my book on him. So it is striking to see how often he talks about unity. Unity in the church, unity in the world, unity, unity, unity. And so for him, synodality has to be understood as something that has to help keep the church united, reunited, one, and so on. That is a very important thing for him. More than breaking boundaries or breaking new ground and so on. It is more on unity that he's focusing on. What this means technically, it's one thing that for him, synodality is very important, but there can be no synodality without collegiality. Meaning, I cannot implement a synodal vision of the church if I am not, if I, as a pope, I am not united with the bishops, and if the bishops are not one with me and united among themselves. That's very important for him, I think. He's really trying to recover a certain sense of unity in the church. And this is a little different from what Francis was doing, because Pope Francis was more on let's break new ground. Let's move into unknown territory, right? And so this, I think Leo is a little different. In that, it's a matter of a personal disposition, but also of a different reading of where the church is right now in 2025, 26. That is a situation that is different from when Francis became Pope in 2013, where certain themes were complete taboos. No one could talk about a bunch of things that we now talk about every day normally. But in 2013, he really had to break new ground. And so Pope Leo finds himself in a different situation, because so much has happened in those 12 years of Pope Francis, right? And so it's a mix of the kind of man, of cleric, of bishop. Is Augustinian and not a Jesuit, so we should spend an entire hour on that. But so there's also a sense that we are now in a situation that is different from where Pope Francis started and needed to do certain things, right? So to conclude, I really think Pope Leo will open a new chapter in the history of the synodal process. And of Synodality, he has made some technical moves that tells us that he's investing on that. I think we're going to see a phase that is less flashy, less news making, maybe, but really more entering into the fiber of the body of the church, in really making synodality not something that happens just because of Pope Francis, not something that happened because of Pope Francis and then now back, breaks over back to order and so on. So I think there's something deeper happening because, again, he has been a bishop in Latin America and he has seen how essential it is to recover a real sense of acting, governing as a community, not just as an institution, even if he's a canon lawyer by formation, right? And so it's still early, I think, to draw any conclusion about Pope Leo's pontificate, of course, but this is what I just wanted to offer you because I think that this is where he's moving and some differences compared to his predecessor. So I will stop here. Thank you for your patience, and I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions. Thank you very much.
I do have a question from Audrey who says, what What has Leo said or done about seminary formation for synodality?
Well, not much for now. I think he has given interesting speeches on the formation of the priest for the priesthood. He has not addressed the connection between synodality and the formation of the priesthood, as far as I know. The question of the future of the seminaries is a very important one because, as you know, the seminary is one of the institutions that was created by the Council of Trent 4 centuries ago, basically, and it has not changed that much. This is a real issue. This is an obvious problem in some countries more than others. Now, Pope Leo comes to the papacy as a member of a religious order, which is a little different from the formation and the life of the secular priests who are uh, serving under a bishop and so on. So this is important because having a second pope in a row who comes from a religious order might help us understand that there's something in the formation of the religious orders that works better than the formation in the diocesan seminaries. But that is a key question is, I mean, how much access and what kind of presence for lay and women professors for future priests. That is a key issue, and some countries have done more than others. I mean, some countries did something and then they took steps back. Again, right now, I think he wants to reassure the bishops and the clergy that synodality is not a revenge against them. That's very important to understand. So, for many bishops and many priests, they saw Pope Francis pontificate as an attack against them. And I'm not saying they were right or correct. I'm not saying that was a fair characterization. So, but they felt that Pope Francis' approach to them and synodality was ultimately undermining the ministry of the bishop, the clerical ministry, and so on. And I think Pope Leo knows this, even if he doesn't agree, but he knows that there's this sentiment there, and he's working to reassure that what's going on right now, synodality is not against you. It's not a threat against you. I think this is working. I mean, what I've seen happen in the United States in this last year with the US bishops becoming more and more courageous dealing with the Trump administration. So I think Leo is good at convincing them, as reassuring them. And I think then something else can be done. But right now, I think he's trying to help them get on board and feel that they are not under threat, that this church is not going to become anti-clerical, right? That's where I think we are.
Do you think the Latin American bishops, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, but Medellin Conference influenced the attitude of Francis and Leo towards synodality?
Oh, absolutely. So the conference of the CELAM, of the Latin American Episcopal Council of 1968 in Medellin, in Colombia, was a absolutely transformative experience for the Catholic Church in Latin America. It turned a church that historically had been on the side of the oppressors in a church that decided that it needed to stay on the side of the oppressed. Right? And so it was really a pivotal moment. And so Pope Francis became a Jesuit in that context. And so there are different interpretations of the meaning of Medellin 1968, but it's still there. It's still in the Latin American church, that event. And so there's nothing comparable to Medellin 68 in North America or in Europe. So it's some national events, maybe sometimes, but not at the continental level, right? And so again, so that was an event in 68 done by bishops, right? But they recovered a very deep sense of unity between the bishops and their people. So bishops stopped being seen as princes, as papal legates or papal envoys, right? But more members of their local church. And so, yes, absolutely, Francis is a product of that, but also Prevost. I think, I mean, he decided to go from North America as a missionary to Latin America because Latin America was that kind of church for him in the 1980s, 1990s. So that's what it was. And I think Medellin 68 is not just a Latin American event, it's a global Catholic event. So it inspired so many people around the world to think, well, I mean, Catholicism can change. The church can change, which is obvious to us, but it is not obvious, right? And so, yes, I mean, that's why I think it is true that even after Francis, even after his death, for global Catholicism, the Latin American Catholic Church is a fundamental source for the inspiration of the global Catholic Church right now, much more than it can be Europe, for sure. That is what happened, I think, in these last couple of decades.
So, question from Francis Joseph. They say, Massimo, there's been a few attempts at constitution of the Catholic Church, the most recent in 22, coordinated by the, and I apologize if I pronounce this incorrectly, Vingegaard Institute for Catholic Research. How would such a constitution sit within the parameters of synodality? Are you able to comment on that?
Sure. So there have been several attempts to write a constitution for the Catholic Church. One of them, the most famous one, was a few years after Vatican II, when Paul the Sixth, he appointed a commission with the task of drafting a constitutional law for the church, the Lex Ecclesiae Fundamentalis, or the acronym LEF. And by the way, in the Vatican, just a few weeks ago, they published a volume with those drafts and so on. And so in the early 1970s, that project was defeated because the best Catholic theologians at that time, in the early 70s, they said something with which I agree very much, which is this. If you write a constitution for the Catholic Church, you will end up making of the Catholic Church something that is a political legal structure, and it will constrain the efforts of the church of keeping together the institutional, legal, formal element and the spiritual one. It will end up something like, I mean, I'm not, I mean, I don't want to make too much of this, but it is like saying in 1848, Karl Marx had a certain idea of justice for the workers and so on, but then you end up with the Soviet Union, right? And so here it is totally right to insist that every Catholic has rights, that no Catholic should be abused, that we have a right of recourse, we have a right to be heard. But all of this, right? I'm totally opposed to the idea of having a constitution running the Catholic Church, because the first thing that happens is that those who are in charge of the church will be the lawyers. And I don't know who wants that. Not even the lawyers probably want that, right? And so here, so I think it's essential to keep fighting for the role of women in the church, for, okay, all of this. But once you bring in the instrument constitution, it's very dangerous, not, and even without opening the, I mean, can of worms, that, I mean, the instrument constitution is very much a Western European instrument that doesn't fit with the idea of how other cultures, other peoples organize themselves. And it, as you know, these days, constitutions as an instrument are in deep trouble, okay? Because you have, I mean, Trumpism, you have the populism, those who say you you have this constitution that on paper says wonderful things, okay, but in practice it protects only those who don't need to be protected, right? And so there's a whole disconnect, right? And so here I think that it's something we have to be careful when we choose the instrument with which we want to fight for certain fundamental things. And I don't dispute the impetus and the I mean thirst for those things, but the instrument constitution, I think it's a double-edged sword in the best of the cases.
Yeah. So there's a number of questions about, you know, sort of, or some of the comments and questions are around the challenges of really implementing synodality in the U.S. Specifically, Barbara's asking. There's a big challenge of big money special interest funds fund and influencing the agendas of dioceses and apostolates. Legatus says they reference Legatus members around 5,000 people and have their fingerprints on 100 of the more influential apostolates in the U.S. And, you know, just generally the question is, okay, so if there's that kind of influence going on, and there were also questions around priests not being really motivated to engage in this process because they feel it's you know, taking away from something that they're doing. And then finally a question of around, you know, do we need to get to, you know, essentially a Vatican III in order to really get this implemented? In general, where, you know, how do we move this forward?
Well, so money in the church in some countries has become much more influential than it used to be, or much more political, right? So uh, it's obvious, this is obvious. And I don't have recipes of how, other than saying this, that there are things that in the church have an energy and have an audience that those who have deep pockets are not interested in talking about, right? And so here I think that there is an energy where you don't need that much money to make an impact, right? And so there are some, I mean, some issues like, I mean, abuse or women in the church and so on. So they can rely on a certain kind of investment that doesn't need to to be monetary, right? And so here we cannot outspend them. It's clear. I mean, the playing field is not fair, okay? But the issues are not equal, and so some issues just don't need that much money. I think because there's more attention in the media for those things. So that's why I don't think we should get discouraged, right? On Vatican III, I don't know if there will be a Vatican III ever. In the sense, not just because we are still digesting Vatican II and all of that, but because Vatican III, by definition, a council like Vatican III means a council whose members are only bishops. And I don't know if this is the best way to solve certain things in the Catholic Church. With an assembly, a legislative assembly made only of bishops. So it's very much into question whether there will be another council in church history like Vatican II. I mean, Vatican II might have been the last one. And then we are moving towards a synodal. So, I mean, the second millennium has been dominated by a certain kind of councils, culminating with Trent in the 16th century, then Vatican I and the Vatican II. The third millennium might be different, right? So synods made of bishops and lay people together, and so that we are still very much in flux, in an uncertain situation, because I don't know if asking only celibate male to deliberate on certain things is a good idea. Not talking about the fact that right now in the global Catholic Church we have twice the number of bishops we had at Vatican II. So I don't know where you can have a legislative assembly made of 6,000 members, as it would be today, right? That's not so. Already Vatican II reached a certain limit, I think, and right now I have serious doubts that that would work and that would be helpful.
Certainly, St. Peter's was pretty busy the first time.
Yes.
Yeah, and further to that, I guess the comment was, I guess we don't need to try and repeat Vatican II, but rather come up with a more inclusive format that's not just bishops and cardinals.
Yeah. Yes. Well, yes. So the synod can be changed, can be adapted in ways that have been made possible by Pope Francis.
Right.
Already, right? While the institution of the council is legally in canon law made by bishops only or clerics who are hierarchically at the same level of bishop. And there's no way that it's simple enough to change council to open to other participants. And so that's why I think the future, and so this is a key point. So the future of the church will be much more about synodality, meaning synods, much more about that than about conciliarity. And this is something, so it's important when we discuss, for example, with our Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters, right? Because for them, synodality and conciliarity, they are different things. And until Vatican II, for us, conciliarity and so they were almost the same thing. And for us today as well, they are becoming two different things.
So do you see this is Kathy, question from Kathy. How do you see the work of the study groups feeding into the process, both collegial and synodal, for continuing the work of renewal in the spirit of Vatican II?
So all these groups have been working. Some of them have published their conclusions. Everything is pretty much on pause because we need to see what Pope Leo will make of that. And so all these groups are working. So the synod is still producing. We are now in this phase of discovering Pope Leo, and I think this is also something that affects the work of these commissions because they know that they need to submit something to a pope who is no longer Francis, right? And so we haven't seen major newsmaking reports coming out. It's just let's continue on this. But I mean, we will have to see, for example, what will be the theme of the next synod of bishops, which might be 2028. We know that Pope Leo has decided already something interesting for October 2026, a meeting in Rome of the presidents of the bishop conferences to talk about Amoris Laetitia 10 years after. I think that by October 26, we will have a sense of where he's moving and what kind of synod he has in mind for the future, what kind of membership, what kind of thing. Right now, we are in a phase of transition and of wait and see from my part, I would say.
Very good. Well, unless anyone has any further questions, we've had lots of comments indicating how much they've enjoyed the conversation today, Massimo. And so I think at this point I'd like to turn it over to our colleague Christine, and we'll do that right now.
So yeah, my name is Christine Weiskener. I'm also on the board of CLC, and I am very honored to be able to express gratitude on behalf of Concerned Lay Catholics, but also on behalf of everyone here today. We are so thankful for your thoughtful, clear articulation of how synodality is both rooted in and a development of our guiding star, the Second Vatican Council. We also are grateful not just for your presence with us today, but how in general you help all of us as a church to understand more deeply and embrace and implement the council and synodality in a way which takes into account the historical context, not just of the council, but of our own time. So we're really, really grateful for you being with us today and for all the work that you do for the church.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My pleasure. It's been a great pleasure.
Yes, I echo all of Christine's words, and we have now come to the end of our time together for today. We hope that you are as inspired as I am after hearing Massimo's really excellent presentation. And I also very much love the Q&A as well. So the recording of today's presentation will be made available on our CLC website in a few weeks. If you are a subscriber to CLC, you will receive the recording link in a future newsletter. To stay informed about future programs and events, as I mentioned earlier, please sign up on our website, concernedlaycatholics.ca, if you have not already done so. Thank you to everyone who supports us through your presence, your prayers, and your talents. You are the reason that we as volunteers do this work. If it is within your means to make a financial contribution to help us bring you more great programs, you may do so at our website. We are a registered charity, and you will receive a charitable receipt for income tax purposes. Most of all, we ask for your prayers. This work is a long-term commitment, and we need your support and God's grace to persist. Please plan to join us for the following 2 upcoming events. On Sunday, May 24th, when Dr. Rose Alma MacDonald will speak on human trafficking, a challenge for Indigenous communities. And again on Thursday, June 4th, as we mark the first anniversary of our national synodal gathering, the Journey of Encounter, which was held last June at St. Jerome's University. We are pleased to present this anniversary event in partnership with the Oblates. It will feature a distinguished panel and a roundtable discussion on the spirituality of synodality with Bishop Alain Faubert, Sandra Prather, Ron Rollheiser, and Monique Washnug. And please also watch our website for other activities to mark the anniversary and to advance synodality in Canada. As you leave here today, we hope you are enriched in your understanding of what it means to be the church, confirmed in your faith in the liberating spirit of Jesus, and that you are inspired to do whatever is given to you to do to build up the body of Christ in our place and in our time. Our prayer continues to be for lay Catholics everywhere to come together, to learn together, to pray together, and to act together for healing, reconciliation, and transformation. Thank you again to our excellent and so well-informed speaker, Dr. Faggioli, for being with us all the way from Ireland. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. God bless you all and enjoy the coming week.